Hi, and welcome to Naturalist 101. My name is Stephanie Tuning, and I am the Coastal Education Coordinator here at 100 Miles. And we're so happy to have you all here attending our first Naturalist 101 of 2021. So we do appreciate you coming tonight. We do want to give a special thanks to our members that are watching tonight because with your membership, it allows us to do these programs. So thank you so much. And I actually have this very special pleasure of introducing my colleague tonight. Alex Muir is our advocacy coordinator here for 100 Miles, and she's going to share all the exciting things that we are working on in this new year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over. Oh, one more thing. You won't be able to talk tonight. However, if you look on your bar where it has all of your things, there is a question and answer and also a chat box. So feel free to add any questions that you have in there or any comments along the way, and we'll be happy to read those and then ask those questions along the way. So thank you so much, and here's Alex.
Thanks, Stephanie. So, hey, everybody. Like Stephanie said, I'm the advocacy coordinator with 100 Miles, and I get to work on grassroots organizing as well as issues at the Capitol. I'm going to take tonight to go through to some of our priorities that we're looking at in 2021. And so you have them here up in front of you. We're going to start by looking at coal ash, and then we'll move to trust funds. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're working on with flood risk mitigation. And then I'm going to turn less on the legislative angle and more to grassroots organizing, because it's an important time for both our Okefenokee protection campaign as well as our Spaceport Camden campaign. So I would be remiss if I did not take the opportunity to just let you guys know how you can make a difference for both of those campaigns as well. Before we jump into 2021, there were some good things that happened in 2020, believe it or not, right at the very beginning. We did have some victories in the legislative session, so I just want to highlight those. The Georgia legislature is on a two-year cycle, and we ended the second year in 2020, so we're of a two-year cycle. So now we're moving into the first year in 2021. So that means that any legislation that was introduced last year that didn't pass or didn't go anywhere, it's going to die. It's already died. And we have to get it reintroduced this year in 2021, and it'll be around for both 2021 and 2022. But just to highlight some of the victories we had in 2020, before all of the bills that didn't get through died, we did get our trust funds resolution through. So HR 64 was the trust funds, putting the honesty back in our trust funds, and that ended with Amendment 1 in our November election. It passed with an 82% success rate. And we're really excited to see that pass, because what it means is that when you're assessed a fee at different types of facilities, so whether it's a landfill and there's tipping fees that are assessed, or as a consumer and you buy new tires, you pay a fee, that money is supposed to go into the funding at the state level for a specific purpose, which is why the legislature passed that fund in the first place and started assessing those fees. But unfortunately, they weren't able to actually direct that revenue to that intended purpose without what we passed through HR 64 and what all of Georgia passed with Amendment 1. So we were excited to see that pass in 2020. We also had coal ash bill SB 123 pass, and what this did was raise tipping fees from $1 a ton for coal ash going to landfills to $2.50 a ton. This had been a loophole that was passed, or I will say, I guess it was omitted in a way. The tipping fee was raised for household garbage to $2.50 a ton during, I believe it was 2018, it may have been 2017, but either way, it passed for household garbage. But the last minute, coal ash was actually taken out and kept back at that $1 a ton fee. So in 2020, we were able to raise that fee for coal ash to $2.50, bringing it to a level playing field as household garbage, even though it's logically you would think, well, coal ash is pretty dangerous and hazardous. Maybe we should be charging more than what we charge household garbage, but certainly we should not be putting a fee that's less than household garbage. So that is what SB 123 did. And then finally, the Heritage Preserves Bill. This got a lot of coverage. It was HB 906. And it really came toward after the session reconvened, after we kind of figured out and got our footing with COVID. This bill would have allowed a state agency to, specifically DNR, to sell private heritage preserves, 15 acres or less of them, to a private entity. And we were able to work with a group of citizens and other organizations in McIntosh County to stop this and just pump the brakes on this so that we could work with all the stakeholders in order to figure out what needs to be done so that these properties are maintained, but we're also protecting them for the public in perpetuity. So with that, I'm going to jump into what we're looking at for 2021, starting with coal ash. And yes, we were excited to get SB 123 passed, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'm going to start by talking about what was House Bill 756 in 2020. This is a bill that would require that any coal ash pond that is not lined, that any of the coal ash in it would be removed and either put into a lined pond or put into a landfill that has a lining, as well as it needs to have a leachate system. And this is important because as a result of some federal rules, there are decommissioning coal ash ponds and that don't meet a certain standard. And in Georgia, we have 10 ponds that they're proposing to cap in place, which means that they're not going to use them anymore and they're going to cover them up. Unfortunately, a lot of these ponds don't have any lining or leachate system. And actually they're sitting right, a lot of them right, the coal ash is sitting right in your aquifer and it's contaminating our drinking water. The whole reason this coal ash ended up in the coal ash ponds is because it was a contaminant to our air. And what they did is they took the fly ash from coal-fired power plants and put it into these ponds with water to keep it down from contaminating our air. Well, unfortunately, that then led to water contamination and groundwater contamination. And so what this legislation does, it will not be HB 756. It'll hopefully come back as something new in 2021. But what this will do is require that the coal ash that is being capped in place needs to only be capped in place if there is a liner and a leachate system. What it would do is just eliminate a lot of the harmful impacts that we're seeing in communities where their groundwater is actually being contaminated by carcinogens and other toxins that you have in coal ash. So how we got to where we are, where coal ash is such a hot topic at the under the Gold Dome in the legislature, is the result of a catastrophe that happened in 2008 in Kingston, Tennessee, where there was a breach in a coal ash pond that resulted in coal ash spreading 300 acres beyond the site. So that's in the background. You can see there's a farmhouse and a outbuilding behind the text that's all covered and entrenched really in coal ash. So as a result of this catastrophe, the Obama administration began to draft rules for coal ash residuals and how to store them safely and dispose of them safely. And that in 2015 was the first time that we really had national rules to address how we safely store and dispose of coal ash. And as a result of those rules that were put into place, Georgia applied to oversee the process of decommissioning these coal ash ponds through the state's jurisdiction. And so Oklahoma and Georgia are the only states that have applied to the EPA and have been approved to oversee this process themselves, or at least they were the last two, the only two last time I checked. So they have taken over that process, and EPD will be going through with Georgia Power and the community, and they're already doing this on how each pond will be closed. Where the issue really is for the legislature is that the rules that EPD is having to follow are not quite strict enough to protect the residents that are seeing the impacts to their groundwater. And Juliet, Georgia, last year in Forsyth, Georgia, we saw a lot of press with them during the legislative session because they are seeing significant impacts to their private drinking water wells to the point where it's unsafe for them to consume their water. And that is from Plant Share, which is in the area and is, I believe, the largest coal-fired power plant in North America. So these are not just small municipal issues that we're having to deal with coal ash. These are huge, really national level issues that EPD is taking on. It is a big lift for the state. And so it's going to really require us to weigh in and our leaders under the Gold Dome to weigh in too. If you want to reach out to your legislator and ask them to take on this issue in 2021, the link below, protectgeorgia.org, with that specific code behind it, will allow you to just quickly send an email to your legislator asking that they take this issue up in 2021. And you know, it's tough being behind a screen all the time and having to interact with legislators this way, but this is the year where we need people advocating from home more than ever. And so if you're able to follow a link and do that, that's great. But even more so if you're able to call or text or get in touch with your legislators, however you know how to ask them to take on this issue, that is what we'll have to rely on doing this year. So with that, I'm going to switch over to trust funds. You thought we were done. We're not done with trust funds. There's just some kind of maintenance bills that we have to get through this year. We were excited to pass Amendment 1 during the November elections. However, the way that the amendment was written, we need to go back into the laws that were passed to create these trust funds and write specifically into them what programs the money should go to or the revenue should go to and what agency will be using that revenue. And so there are a few final lifts that we need to get through to make sure that we're going to get the hazardous site cleanups that we've all already paid for as consumers and residents of Georgia. So this year during our Capital Conservation Day, it'll be virtual, of course, and we'll be taking on this issue, asking everyone who attends to meet with their legislators with groups of other residents from their area. And we'll set up Zoom calls that will be prepping you for, and then there with you to guide you through talking to your legislator about this issue. And I believe we'll even potentially be zooming in from a few of these cleanup sites that this money should really be going toward cleaning up, and it's been diverted. This isn't just a few $1,000s we're talking about being diverted from these funds. This is hundreds of millions of dollars that's been diverted over since 1993 to the general fund and going to other uses, when as residents and voters, we've been told that this revenue is going to a specific an intended purpose, and then it's not going to that intended purpose. So we've got a few more, one more bill to get through to get this stuff going in the right direction. With that, I'm going to switch over to flood risk reduction. Oh, I should specify with all of these bills, we are trying to get bills introduced. We don't have bill numbers yet, because with the virtual nature of the legislature this year, we don't have anything introduced yet. But as soon as things are introduced and we have a bill number for you, we will be sure to get that to you. But we're at the stage right now where we just need to be advocating to our legislators that we would like to see legislation introduced. All right, so moving on to flood risk reduction. This is something that, you know, for 100 miles especially, this is our bread and butter. The other two issues that I just talked to you about, we work with our partners at the Georgia Water Coalition on these issues, but flood risk reduction is something that 100 miles is really carrying the weight for at the legislature. And so one bill that we were very excited about last year was HB 1045. And what this bill would have done is allowed the revenue from ad valorem taxes to be used for flood risk reduction projects. The reason that needed to be specified is because the revenue that counties get from ad valorem taxes can only be used for specific purposes that are spelled out in the law. And so the bill was actually quite simple. All it did was define flood risk reduction, which was a variety of projects and programs that could be implemented at the county level to reduce the perils of flooding. And it just added that to the list of things that the local government, the county government, could spend the revenue from ad valorem taxes on. The reason this is important is because the national government passed a new program with FEMA called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or the BRIC program. So like any FEMA program and really any federal program, when there's grants involved, there's a 25% match requirement for a local government or a state government that's applying. Right now, a lot of the funding responsibility for any adaptation is falling to the local governments. Tybee is a great example. They have someone there who's constantly working on receiving grants just in order to be able to adapt and take on the projects that they really need to do in order to keep their community safe. But they are bearing the burden of financing the 25% or whatever the match requirement is of all of those grants. The great thing about HB 1045, or the legislation that was in HB 1045, is it would allow counties or unincorporated areas like St. Simons, like the islands that we have up just west of Tybee, to use the county money in order to provide that match. So unfortunately, this legislation would not have helped Tybee because they are incorporated, but it could have helped a lot of other areas around our coast. And quite frankly, it could have helped a lot of other inland communities too that get riverine flooding. Even just one county inland from our coastal counties, they do see tidal fluctuations in their river and a lot of flooding as a result. So this bill has a lot of promise. We've been told by Representative Hogan, he's publicly said he's going to reintroduce it. But of course, we need to reach back out to him and follow up as a community to make sure that he is going to reintroduce this, because he has yet to do so in 2021. So we're still hoping that he will. To go a little bit beyond just the flood risk reduction level, and what we've seen that introduced in 2020, and we're hoping to see it reintroduced in 2021. To take it a step further, I want to highlight a larger legislative campaign that we're working on, which is to see a flood risk reduction council or adaptation council introduced in the state of Georgia. So officially in 2020, South Carolina created their flood risk mitigation council, which leaves Georgia as the only state along the Atlantic coast without some sort of state sanctioned commission or council or cabinet position solely with the purpose of addressing flood risk mitigation and climate change adaptation. So every other state along the Atlantic coast and all the coastal states in the country, except for 6, have these adaptation councils. And what these councils do is they're either created through executive order or through legislation. And their primary purpose is to create an adaptation plan for the state and then report annually back to the governor and the legislature about how the state is doing on accomplishing their adaptation plan and what steps they can take to move it along. Oftentimes that requires legislative steps. So it's a great kind of liaison between the experts that are doing the research in the field and then the legislators who are actually making the laws and passing them. So you can see on the list here, they do a few other things other than just reporting to the governor. They actually do the analysis of what vulnerabilities there are, whether it be physical vulnerability or a gap in data. So they are doing that along every state along the Atlantic coast. And then they're also looking at different mechanisms for funding those projects I was talking about, where you have to have a 25% match for grants, or maybe a community is just deciding to take something on themselves and not go after grant funding. These commissions or these councils are looking at creative ways in order to provide state funding for those projects. So a few examples of what has come out of these commissions in other states that's been really helpful and we really hope to emulate in Georgia. In Maryland, there was a living shoreline requirement that passed, which said that soft shoreline stabilization structures need to be prioritized, and hard shoreline stabilization structures, so your seawalls or anything that would prevent the marsh from migrating westward as sea levels rise, those are only secondary options. The first thing you have to look at are things like living shorelines, which are going to not only fare much better in storms because there's not as much reconstruction cost, but it's also going to allow as water levels rise in the ocean, our marsh can migrate westward rather than just hitting against a seawall and not being able to go anywhere. The other things that they've looked at are permits or requirements for buildings that are publicly funded. And this has been done in Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Maine. And I specifically like the idea of looking at permitting and just requiring that a state take a specific sea level rise projection that's adopted by the state into consideration before they permit things like landfills or anything else that could potentially lead to a detrimental outcome for the community when you're looking a couple of decades down the line and you're going to have increased flooding, a higher water table, and potentially stronger storms. So that is a great one because it doesn't require really any funding. It just requires you to look at how you're doing your permitting process. The other simple one that would not cost the state any money is legislation that would require a change in the comprehensive planning process in order to require a local community to get they have to do a comprehensive plan every 5 years and every 10 years with updates every 5 years to decide how they're going to use their land. What is the zoning going to be like? In those states you see listed there, the requirement is that in your comprehensive plan and in your comprehensive plan update, you have to consider the projection of sea level rise and how you're zoning land. So again, doesn't cost the state any money, but it simply just requires communities to take a hard look at what they're actually planning for in the future. And then I mentioned the revolving loan funds that a lot of states are looking at. You'll see there several states have implemented those revolving loan funds as a result of recommendations from their councils, from their flood risk reduction councils. And then finally, private flood insurance markets. This is something that several national groups are pushing for, and they've done it in Florida. Right now in Georgia, there's nothing that eliminates someone from being able to offer flood insurance, but it has to meet certain requirements with the National Flood Insurance Program in order to qualify for a mortgage. There's really no framework at all that's helping guide insurers to offer these products. And so what they did in Florida, is that they created 4 different options through legislation of different types of flood insurance that would be beneficial to communities and to people that have homes that are maybe beyond the $250,000 cap that the National Flood Insurance is willing to cover. So this is another thing that came out of a Resilience and Flood Adaptation Council that we're also looking at as well. To take a quick look at what this could mean for Georgia, we had an analysis done by students at Georgia Tech. They cross-referenced the FEMA flood zone maps and the tax assessor's data of home values to see how many homes were at risk based on sea level rise and what would be the potential cost of that risk. So you can see for St. Simon's Island at 1 foot of sea level rise, 179 homes, and that corresponds to about $2.5 million worth of damage. And what I mean by at risk is that they're at risk of having a high tide flooding. So it won't be there all the time, but they could be impacted by high tides and what they call high tides, which are toward the upper end of the spectrum. And then on Tybee, you can see that the risk is even greater. Fortunately, Tybee's already taking on a lot of this adaptation at the local level, but certainly considering the influence of the ports at the state level, the ports are one of the biggest generators of not only jobs, but also revenue in the state. There's a significant amount of land development and expansion for industrial warehouses on the north end of our coast. So the state is investing in the ports, and I think it's really time the state invest in our coast and making it more resilient so we can continue to have a viable coast for these ports as well as the communities that live along the coast. So in order to address this legislation for 2021, what we're asking residents and advocates to do is to contact Representative Hogan and ask him to reintroduce the legislation that was in HB 1045 last year. And of course, to thank him when you reach out to him. His email is at that third bullet. And then you can also email him. There's a link on the last line at 100miles.org/sea level rise. I know our website was just kind of revamped. And so I don't believe that link is quite live yet, but if you visit it, it'll be up by Monday if you want to send an email directly to Don Hogan about this issue. And then on that same note, Governor Kemp as well, explaining to him that Georgia is falling behind. That makes us less competitive for those grants that I mentioned. We're missing out on opportunities for funding. So it's really time that we see some leadership within the state level to get our coast ready and adapting to the risk of flood. And then, like I mentioned, I would be remiss if I did not bring up the couple of grassroots issues that we're working on. So as many of you know, the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge is in danger right now because there is a proposal to mine Trail Ridge. And Trail Ridge is not actually in the Okefenokee. It is an ancient sand dune that was created when water levels were much higher. And it is now the barrier for the Okefenokee Swamp, keeping in all the fresh water. This resource is really, I mean, it's hard you can't overstate, it's hard to even explain how unique it is. It is the largest blackwater swamp in North America, and it is solely fed by rainwater. It's the headwaters for two of our most visited and appreciated rivers, the Swanee River as well as the St. Mary's River. And if we let Twin Pines get through to to Trail Ridge and begin mining, we aren't sure about what the hydrology, how it'll be impacted. And so what we're asking people to do is contact Governor Kemp, because unfortunately, what was a federal issue has now become a state level issue. There were rollbacks at the end of the Trump administration that limited the reach of the Clean Water Act. And so there had been a need for a clean water permit, and now there no longer is that need. And so the only permits that will be required for the mine are permits that come from the Department of Natural Resources. And so we are asking that our advocates reach out to Governor Kemp at the link below, just to ask him to oppose the mine formally and do everything he can to help the EPD prevent this mine from happening. So if you have any questions about that, I can answer more, but Alice Keyes is our lead on this issue. And then the last issue I am going to share with you tonight is about Spaceport Camden. And you may or may not know a lot about this. It hasn't gotten a ton of coverage, especially on the north end of the coast, but this has really developed quickly in the last year or so. There's been $9 million of tax dollars invested into this project that has never actually received a formal vote by the residents of Camden County to pursue. That what they're hoping to do is build a launch facility. So the launch facility would be owned by Camden County, but it would be an opportunity for private companies to launch rockets in order to do what they do. So the issue is that this is an inland launch pad, and it's going to go over several really vulnerable areas, including the Satilla River, our salt marsh, Cumberland Island. It also will impact homes, that it's going to go directly over residents' homes as well. I apologize, I'm distracted. I'm at home and there is a noise downstairs that sounds like someone's locked out, but I'm going to leave them to figure that out for themselves. All right, so we have a link down at the bottom. And so you can visit that link to, we have several options of letters that you can contribute right now. The DNR is looking at the consistency of the proposal for Spaceport Camden with the policies that we use to manage our coast. And based on the impact it would have on endangered species, the impact it could have on the marsh, as well as the closures that would result in public waterways where people rely on recreational fishing as well as charter fishing, we feel that it is not compatible with our coast, and we hope you feel the same as well. So if you visit that link, there are several options for things you can do, for messages you can send to DNR in order to express how you feel about opposing Spaceport Camden. And with that, that was very quick. So we'll have time for questions if y'all want to include questions in the chat.
So thank you, Alex, for going over all the stuff that I know you've been working so hard on. But it looks like we do have, just a comment saying how informative you have been, which you always are in sharing all of this with us.
Well, of course, if you guys have any questions throughout the legislative session, you can always feel free to contact us. We are doing our best to keep people in touch while this has turned to a virtual legislative session. We have not been up the Capitol at all, and we do not currently have plans to be up there, especially not before Capitol Conservation Day. But we have been organizing phone calls and Zoom meetings with the legislators. So please reach out if you have any desire to join us for a Zoom call with your legislator, or if you have any questions about the issues. But again, we will probably, I expect Megan Desrosiers, our director, will do a legislative update on a weekly basis. However, that may look different this year. I know that next week the legislature is going in for one day, and then we don't know what the schedule holds for the rest of the time. So we will keep you guys up to date as best we know and as we get information.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing all of this with us. Thank you all for coming and supporting 100 Miles. And you probably have already seen it on our social media and through our MailChimps, but I just want to make sure you're all aware of our Choosing to Lead conference this year is going virtual as well. And it actually starts very soon. Our first of this virtual series is going to be on February 2nd, and it is going to be on saving a species. And so it'll be actually be in a conversation having it, and they will continue for the rest of the Tuesdays and through March 2nd. So for a full lineup and to sign up and register for those events, you can go to 100miles/conference to get all of the details. But we're super excited. We have some really awesome presenters and some interesting topics this year. So thanks again. And again, always reach out to Alex or any of us on 100 Miles if you have any concerns and questions or any of that stuff. But other than that, we hope you all have a great evening, and we hope to see you all again in person soon one day.
Yes. Thank you, guys.
Have a good night, everyone.